Night shifts in the hospital are different. The silence is thicker, the shadows longer, and the world outside fades into the distance. But it's not just the stillness that makes the night shift unsettling. It's what happens when the lights go down and the walls seem to whisper. Julie, a nurse who worked late shift for years, never thought she'd encounter something beyond explanation. But one night, she came face to face with a terror she couldn't escape. This is Julie's story. The story of the night she realized that some patients never truly leave. Story: the patient who never left. I have been working the night shift at St. Margaret Hospital for almost 3 years. It's the kind of place that's mostly quiet after hours, with only the hum of machines and the shuffle of footsteps echoing through the hallways. Most nights, it's routine medications, checkups, making sure the patients are comfortable. But then there was that night. It started out just like any other. I was assigned to the ICU, a floor that always felt cold even when the heat was turned up. The lights flickered above me as I made my rounds, checking on the patients who were deep in their sleep, some of them on ventilators, others unconscious. The monitors beeped quietly in the background, keeping rhythm with the silence. But as I passed room 303, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light coming from inside. I was sure I had closed it earlier. The patient in that room, Mr. Howard, had been in a coma for weeks after a car accident. There was no sign of improvement, and he hadn't shown any change in condition for days. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw it. Mr. Howard was sitting up in bed. His eyes were wide open, staring ahead, and his breathing was steady, which was impossible. He had been unconscious for so long that the doctors had all but given up hope. But there he was, sitting straight up, looking as if he was waiting for something. I froze. There was no explanation. The room felt colder now, almost unnatural. I checked his pulse, nothing. I checked his vitals, nothing. But still, he was sitting there, his eyes fixed on the wall in front of him, unblinking. I tried to speak to him, to shake him out of whatever state he was in. "Mr. Howard, can you hear me?" He didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed, but there was no sign of recognition, no sign of life. His face was pale, and his skin had an unnatural, waxy sheen to it, like a mannequin's. I reached for the call button, but the moment I touched it, something strange happened. The monitors around his bed started to beep rapidly, and the lights overhead flickered violently. I stepped back, startled, and that's when I noticed something even worse. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move. They weren't like ordinary shadows. These ones twisted and stretched along the walls, curling around the bed, growing and shrinking as though they were alive, responding to Mr. Howard's presence. My heart raced, and I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the doorframe for support. That's when Mr. Howard moved. His head turned slowly toward me, and I swear I felt my blood run cold. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, in the silence, I heard it, a whisper, so faint that I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or something far darker. "Help me?" The voice was raspy, cracked, and it didn't sound like Mr. Howard at all. It sounded wrong. I took a step back, my breath shallow, and I reached for the door, ready to leave the room. But before I could turn the handle, I heard him speak again. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was clearer now, louder. And then, before I could react, the lights in the room went out completely, plunging me into darkness. The beeping of the monitors stopped, and the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, like I had walked into a tomb. I didn't wait for anything else. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still hear his voice echoing in my mind. You shouldn't have come. The next morning, the doctors were shocked when they found Mr. Howard exactly where I had left him, unconscious, hooked up to machines, just as he had been for weeks. There was no sign of any change, but I knew what I saw. That night, I never went back to room 303, and to this day, every time I walk down the hospital halls at night, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me from behind the doors, waiting for me to come closer. Mr. Howard's voice still lingers in my mind, a constant whisper I can't ignore. And I'll never forget the words he said, "You shouldn't have come." After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Howard. His body was still, but his eyes, they haunted me. They were so wide, so unblinking, as if he had seen something no one was supposed to see. But there was no way to explain it. The doctor said he was still in a coma, that there had been no changes in his condition. But I knew what I had seen. The next few shifts were torturous. I would walk past room 303, always feeling that icy chill crawl up my spine, as if someone was standing just behind the door, watching me. I tried to focus on my duties, to ignore the creeping dread that followed me through the hallways, but it wasn't easy. Every corner of the hospital seemed to be a reminder that night. Whispers in the dark, a shadow shifting just out of sight. Then it happened again. It was late one evening, well after midnight, when I was called to check on a new patient. The hospital was quieter than usual, almost too quiet. I walked through the empty corridors, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I passed by room 303, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was open. I knew it was locked earlier, locked tight, just as it had always been. But now, the door stood wide open, the light inside flickering like a faulty bulb. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to approach, but my feet moved on their own. I stepped into the room, my breath shallow, my eyes scanning the darkened corners. And then I heard it, a soft, barely audible whisper coming from the corner of the room. "Julie," my name. It was Mr. Howard's voice. I turned quickly, my eyes searching the shadows. But there was no sign of him. The bed was empty, the sheets crumpled and cold. But the air felt thick, heavy, like something was waiting, something unseen. "Julie, help me." This time, the voice was louder, and it wasn't just coming from the corner. It seemed to echo around the room, bouncing off the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The words were distorted, almost like someone was whispering through a wall, through the very fabric of the hospital itself. I stumbled back, my hands trembling as I reached for the door. The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply, like the warmth had been sucked out of the air. And that's when I saw it, the shadow. It was standing at the foot of the bed, a tall, dark shape that stretched unnaturally across the room. The figure was indistinct, its features hidden in the darkness. But I could feel it. I could feel its eyes on me, like it was studying me, waiting for me to do something. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "Julie, come closer," the voice whispered. "Help me, please." I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I backed away, stumbling toward the door, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't escape it. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the figure was calling me, pulling me into the darkness. I don't remember how I got out of the room. All I remember is running as fast as I could down the hall, the sound of the whispers still in my ears, still echoing in my mind. The next morning, I told the head nurse about what happened, but she just brushed it off like I had imagined it. "Julie, you're working long shifts," she said. "It's probably just exhaustion. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the way Mr. Howard's voice sounded, begging for help, when he had no reason to speak. The thing is, I don't think it was him. I think something else is in that room, something that is pretending to be him. And every time I pass by room 303 now, I can feel it. I can feel the eyes watching me from the darkness inside. I hear the whispers, soft and persistent, calling my name. I don't know how long I can keep working here. I don't know how long I can ignore the shadows. All I know is that something in that room, something dark, is waiting for me, waiting for the next nurse to walk in and to never leave. The days after that night, I thought I was just imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every time I walked down the ICU hallway, I couldn't help but glance toward room 303. It was always empty, the blinds drawn tight, the door closed, but something felt wrong. The air around that room was colder, thicker, like it had a presence that I couldn't escape. Then came the second incident. It was a week later. I was working another late shift, alone as usual. I was walking down the hall, heading toward the nurse's station when I heard something, a soft, rustling noise coming from the direction of room 303. It was so faint that at first I thought it was just the sound of the building settling. But as I walked closer, the noise grew louder, almost as if something or someone was moving inside. I stopped in front of the door. My hand hovered over the handle. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I couldn't explain why. I knew the room should be empty. Mr. Howard had been transferred to a different floor. There was no reason for the room to be occupied, but the rustling continued, almost like sheets being tugged, like someone was shifting in bed. I took a deep breath, convincing myself it was nothing. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the nightlight by the bed. But when I stepped inside, I froze. The bed was empty, completely empty. But the sheets were tangled, as if someone had been lying there moments before. I glanced around the room, and my heart skipped a beat. The window, which was always locked and sealed tight, was open, the curtains fluttering in the breeze. Before I could even think, I heard a low, guttural sound behind me, a soft groan. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But there was nothing. The room was still, too still, and then I heard it again, louder this time, like a low murmur coming from the corner of the room. I pointed the flashlight toward the sound, but all I saw were shadows. No figure. No movement. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. But the room was locked. I was trapped. The whispers started again. I couldn't understand the words, but they were there, swirling in the air, so close that I could feel them brushing against my skin. And then the faintest sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned quickly, but the room was still empty. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. And then, through the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, standing in the far corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the bed. The shadow moved. It wasn't just standing there. It shifted, as if it was reaching out toward me. I screamed and ran toward the door, pounding on it, begging for someone to hear me. My breath was ragged, my body trembling. But when I turned back, the shadow was gone. The room was empty again. The door clicked open, as if it had been unlocked from the outside. I don't know how I got out of that room. My hands were shaking as I left, but as I turned back to look, I swear I saw something standing at the window. A figure, dark and formless, watching me from the shadows. The next morning, I was too shaken to work. I told the doctor about what happened, about the noises, the shadow. He dismissed it as fatigue, said I was imagining things. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. And now, every time I pass room 303, I feel it, the cold, the darkness, the presence watching me. I don't know what's in that room, but I know it's not just Mr. Howard. It's something else. Something that should never have been allowed to wake. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Mr. Howard's room. The voice he had whispered to me, I tried to tell myself it was just a hallucination, that I had imagined it from the stress. But deep down, I knew better. For the next few nights, I couldn't bring myself to check on him. I stayed away from room 303 as much as I could, even though I knew it was my job. But then one night, I was assigned to the night shift again, and I had to go back. I had no choice. It was late when I approached the door to Mr. Howard's room, the hallway stretching endlessly before me, the soft buzzing of the lights overhead the only sound. I stood outside for a moment, listening for anything unusual. The silence was heavy, like it was holding its breath. I pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in the quiet. I could feel my heart racing in my chest as I entered. The room was dimly lit, the machines humming softly, but everything seemed normal. Too normal. Mr. Howard was still in his bed, his chest rising and falling gently with each breath. He looked the same as always. But then I noticed something strange. The bedside table was moved. It was a small table, just beside the bed, but had been shifted just slightly, almost as if someone had been sitting there. There was no reason for it to be out of place. I took a step closer to the bed, my eyes drawn to Mr. Howard's face. His eyes were closed, but there was something about him that didn't feel right. He was too still, too perfect. I couldn't look away. And then in the stillness of the room, I heard it again. That whisper. Julie, it was faint but unmistakable. His voice, raspy and cracked, came from his mouth, but his lips didn't move. I froze, unable to move. My pulse raced in my ears, the blood rushing to my head. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thickening around me as if I were suffocating. I leaned in closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the call button. But before I could press it, Mr. Howard's eyes snapped open. They were black, hollow, not the eyes I had seen before. Those eyes were full of life, but these were empty, like the eyes of something that shouldn't be alive. Julie, he whispered again, his voice coming from his chest, his mouth still unmoving. You shouldn't be here. I backed away slowly, my legs shaky, and then the room went cold. So cold I could see my breath. The air felt heavy, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. It was as if the walls were closing in around me. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, panic rising in my chest. My heart pounded in my ears as I pulled harder. The room was getting darker. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him move. Mr. Howard's body jerked, his head tilting toward me at an unnatural angle. His arms reached out, long and stiff, stretching toward me like the limbs of something not human. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Just a low, guttural sound like a growl, mixed with the whispers of dozens of voices calling my name. I screamed. I don't remember how I managed to get out, but I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But deep down I knew Mr. Howard wasn't just a patient. He wasn't just in a coma. He was something else. Something that had never truly left. The next morning, the doctors came to check on him, just like every other day. But when they opened the door to his room, he was gone. There was no sign of him, no evidence he had ever been there. The bed was empty, the sheets pristine, and all the machines turned off. No trace of Mr. Howard. I thought I was losing my mind. But then that evening, as I was leaving the hospital, I passed by the ICU. I swear I saw his face, just for a second, his hollow eyes staring at me through the glass. And as I walked out into the parking lot, I heard his voice once more, Julie, faint like a whisper in the wind. And I know now, no matter how far I run, he will always be there, waiting, watching, waiting for the moment when I can't escape his gaze. The days after that night passed slowly, but the unease never left. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My mind kept replaying the image of Mr. Howard sitting up in that bed, his empty eyes staring at the wall, his mouth whispering those chilling words. I told myself it was just stress, just my imagination running wild after a long shift. But deep down, I knew it was something more. A few nights later, it happened again. I was working another late shift in the ICU. The hospital was quieter than usual, and the sound of my footsteps echoed down the sterile white halls. I had just finished checking on a few patients when I was called to room 303. The nurses' station had received an alert that Mr. Howard's vitals were fluctuating, but when I checked the monitor, everything looked normal. I wasn't supposed to enter the room without a doctor's order, but something in my gut told me I had to go. I walked into the room, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. The lights were on, and the sound of the ventilator and heart monitor filled the space. Mr. Howard was lying in his bed, as still as he had been before. His face was pale, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I sighed in relief, thinking I might have been imagining things. But then I noticed something. The blankets on his bed, his hands, were different. They weren't in the same position as I had left them. The sheets were pulled tighter, and his hands, which had been resting by his sides, were now placed over his chest in a perfect, unnatural pose. I took a step closer, my heart racing, but I hesitated. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. His eyes were closed, but something about the way his body was positioned, it was wrong. The shadows in the room seemed darker, more pronounced, and the air felt heavier, colder. And then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper, just like before. Julie. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to look at Mr. Howard, but his eyes were still closed. I stepped back, my hand gripping the doorframe, and that's when it happened. His mouth opened, not wide, but just enough for a sound to escape. It was a whisper again. Help me? I couldn't breathe. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't leave. I had to check on him. I reached for the call button, but before I could press it, his eyes opened. Wide, too wide. They were black, empty, like pits that swallowed all light. For a moment, everything went still. His voice, clearer this time, filled the room. You shouldn't have come back, Julie. I backed away, my hand trembling as I tried to steady myself. My vision blurred, and the room around me seemed to warp. I could feel the walls closing in, the air thickening, as though something was pressing against me. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath in front of me. Julie, come closer. Mr. Howard's voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just from him. It came from all around me. It echoed from the walls, from the shadows, and then from inside my own mind. You can't run. I turned and ran out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. The last thing I heard before the door slammed behind me was the sound of his voice, a raspy, desperate sound that seemed to follow me down the hall. The nurses at the station were as shocked as I was. When we checked the cameras, they showed nothing unusual. Mr. Howard's vitals were normal, and he was still resting peacefully in his bed. There was no sign of him having moved at all. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Mr. Howard isn't just a patient. He's something else. Something that doesn't belong in this world. And I've learned that the hard way. I never went back to room 303 again, and the whispers still haunt me to this day. Sometimes, when I walk the halls at night, I hear them again. The whispers, faint at first, but growing louder, calling my name. And I know somewhere Mr. Howard is waiting for me to return and help him. After the incident in room 303, I thought I could just brush it off. I told myself it was just the stress of the night shift, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew what I had seen wasn't a figment of my imagination. The voice, the shadows, they were real and I couldn't escape them. The days that followed were strange. The hospital felt different, as though something had changed. Something had shifted. It wasn't the same place anymore. The halls felt colder, the lights flickered more often, and there was an odd heaviness in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. One night, a few days after the incident, I was on duty again. The hospital was quiet, as it usually was during the graveyard shift. I was walking down the corridor near the ICU when I heard it. A faint whisper, like someone calling my name. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. I turned around, but there was no one there. The hall was empty. My breath caught in my throat. Julie, the whisper came again, and this time I was sure it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It was clear, unmistakable, and it was coming from somewhere in the hallway. I stepped cautiously toward the source of the sound, my eyes scanning the empty hallway. And then I saw it. The door to room 303 was slightly ajar. I froze. I hadn't been back to that room since that night. No one else had been in there, or so I thought. But now, the door was open, and the dim light from inside cast long shadows across the floor. The air felt thick with tension, as if something was waiting for me inside. I approached the door slowly, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were coming from inside the room itself. I stepped into the room, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, just as I had expected. There was no patient in the bed, no sign of anyone having been there recently. But as I stepped further inside, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. On the floor, next to the bed, was a piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, and when I unfolded it, my blood ran cold. The note simply said, "Help me," but the handwriting, it wasn't the same as before. It was different, jagged, distorted, like something or someone was writing with an unnatural hand. I dropped the note in horror, my fingers numb with fear. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The man, Mr. Howard. His figure was standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes locked onto mine. His skin was even more decayed than before, his mouth stretching wide into a grin that was far too large for a human face. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me his eyes hollow and black, as if there was nothing but darkness inside him. Before I could react, the lights in the room flickered violently, and the air turned frigid. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and when I spun around, no one was there, but I could hear him. His voice, deep and raspy, was right next to my ear. "You can't leave. You opened the door. Now you belong to me." I felt a cold wave wash over me, suffocating me, pulling me into the darkness. The room began to spin, and I stumbled backward, crashing into the wall. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before I passed out was Mr. Howard's grinning face, getting closer and closer, his mouth opening wide to swallow me whole. When I woke up, I was back in the nurse's station, my uniform soaked in sweat. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, that I had passed out from exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Howard was still out there, waiting for me to come back. And this time, there would be no escaping him. I don't know how long I'll last at this hospital, but I know one thing. Something is wrong here, and it's not just the spirits of the dead. It's something darker, something that wants to pull me into the grave with them. I thought I was losing my mind after that night, but things only got worse. After Mr. Howard's incident, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the stress of working the night shift. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. They followed me, lurking at the edges of my consciousness, creeping into my thoughts at the most inopportune moments. A few nights later, I was assigned to a different wing of the hospital, one that was even older and more abandoned than the rest of the building. It was an old wing, the kind of place where the paint was peeling off the walls, and the air smelled of mildew and death. I had been there before, but it always made me uneasy. Something about it felt wrong, like the memories of those who passed away there still lingered in the walls. As I made my rounds, checking the rooms of the patients, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd hear a whisper, soft at first, but then louder and louder, until it felt like someone was right behind me. "Julie," the voice would say, just like Mr. Howard's. I turned every corner, expecting to see someone, but the halls were empty. No one was there. The voice sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves, or maybe the very air around me. It felt suffocating. I kept walking, trying to ignore it, telling myself it was all in my head. But when I entered room 214, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The room was empty, just like it had been the night before. But there at the foot of the bed was a note. It was small, written in a shaky hand, and when I picked it up, my hands trembled. It read, "You shouldn't have left." The handwriting was faint, almost illegible, but the words were clear. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner of the room, watching me. But there was no one, only the flickering light overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I backed out of the room, the note still clenched in my hand. I didn't want to leave, but I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. As I walked down the hall, I heard it again, the whisper. It was so close, so real, like it was right beside me. "Julie." The voice was faint but unmistakable. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I turned to look behind me, but no one was there. I was alone in the hallway. The next morning, I tried to tell my supervisor about the note, about the whispering, but she just brushed it off. "You're overworked, Julie," she said. "It's the stress. Just get some rest." But I couldn't shake it. I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. The hospital was haunted, There was no other explanation. The voices, the whispers, they were real. I never went back to that wing again. But even now, when I close my eyes, I hear that voice calling to me from the shadows, from the walls, from the very place where the dead lie waiting. I know what I heard, and I know I wasn't alone that night. And now, I can't help but wonder, if the dead are truly gone, why do they still speak? After that night, I thought I had seen the last of Mr. Howard. I left the hospital for a few weeks, trying to shake the feeling of dread that clung to me, but the memories of that night followed me. The whispers, the shadows, the feeling that I had encountered something not meant for this world. They all stayed with me, lurking in the back of my mind. But one night, a few months later, I returned to the hospital to pick up my belongings. It had been a while since I had worked the night shift, but I figured it would be fine to gather my things and leave quietly. I walked down the familiar hallways, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The building was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle, as if the walls themselves are watching you. I reached the nurse's station, and when I went to collect my things, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A new chart on the counter. A patient who had just been admitted to room 303. I froze. There was no reason for me to feel that cold feeling again, but the moment I saw the name, I knew something was wrong. Mr. Howard's name, written clearly on the chart. I rushed to the ICU to check, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the door to room 303, I hesitated. The memory of that night flooded back, the eerie whisper, the dark shadows. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what had happened. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The bed was empty. The room was dark, colder than the rest of the ICU, and the monitors were off. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain. In the corner of the room, I saw a figure, a man wearing a hospital gown, sitting in the dark, his face turned away from me. I could feel the air grow heavier as I approached. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but I stepped closer. As I reached the bed, the man turned and I froze. It was Mr. Howard, but it wasn't him. His eyes were wide, empty black sockets, his skin a sickly gray. His mouth curled into that same twisted grin, and the whisper came again, soft but clear. "You came back." I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The lights flickered and went out completely. The whisper swirled around me, growing louder all around me, closing in. Julie, it was no longer Mr. Howard's voice. It was 1,000 voices, speaking at once, pulling me toward the bed. I don't know how I managed to get out. I don't know if I ran or if I just woke up, but when I found myself in the hallway again, the door to room 303 was open. The bed was empty. The next morning, I was told that no one had been admitted to room 303. No new patient, no chart. There was no record of Mr. Howard or anyone being in that room. I've never been back to that hospital. I left, and I never looked back. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. They're still there in the back of my mind, waiting for me to remember, waiting for me to come back.